Shabbat Shalom. Such a blessing to see so many of you here today. Really wonderful. Thank you for coming. The words that Cantor Rudy just sang, Uvnucho Yomar, Shuva Adonai Rivavot Alfei Yisrael. When the ark halted, Moses would say, "Return, O Lord, you who are Israel's myriads of thousands," an invitation to come home. Come directly out of this week's Torah portion. Always wonderful when we can find the source of things that we say and hear regularly. And right before it was a verse that we also heard this week, and we hear it every week. But Vayehi bin Soah ha'aron vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai v'yafutzu oivecha v'yanusu misanecha mipanecha. This is Numbers 10, verse 35 and 36. And that's the beginning of our Torah service. When the ark was to set out, Moses would say, "Advance, O God, may your enemies be scattered, may your foes flee before you." These two verses, which are set off by brackets or inverted letter nuns, are considered by classical commentators to be their own book of the Torah, because they're so strange and seem so out of place, and they're so grand. It's like this big mission or a vision of what could be, what was, what ought to be. When the ark went forward, people went scattering. And when it was set down, people came flocking back. You could just rest on those verses all day and just a flight of fancy. And then chapter 11. We've got the ideal and then the reality. Vayehi ha'am kemit onenim ra be'oznei Adonai. The people took to seeking complaints before the Lord. This is not a drash about the art of kvetching. If you want to know about that, you'll have to watch for HaGesher. Because these parshas really are a cycle of kvetching. And there's a lot to think about with that. But this parsha is for many Jewish leaders, and here I'll turn to the immortal wisdom of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory, one of the great Jewish leaders of our time, and he unabashedly refers to this parsha as little less than life-saving. He wrote, "No leadership position is easy, and leading Jews is harder still. Spiritual leadership can be hardest of them all. Leaders try to maintain a public face that is usually calm, upbeat, optimistic, and as relaxed as possible. But behind the facade, we all experience storms of emotion as we realize how deep the divisions are between people, how intractable the problems we face, and how thin the ice on which we stand. Perhaps we all experience such moments at some points in our lives when we know where we are, but we also know where we want to be, and we can't see a route from here to there. That's the prelude to despair." When Rabbi Sacks and my beloved Rabbi Leon Kahane would feel that way, they would turn to this parsha, this searing moment when Moses reaches one of his lowest ebbs, arguably his lowest. The precipitating cause was maybe seemingly a little bit slight. The people were engaged in their favorite activity, complaining about the food, speaking about the fish they ate in Egypt, the cucumbers, melons, leeks, onions, and garlic. Gone is their memory of slavery. All they can recall is the cuisine. Although some commentators say they really weren't complaining about the food, they were complaining about the sexual freedom they imagined that they had in Egypt when they were not subject to the laws of Sinai. God is angry, but Moses is really, really distraught. He suffers an emotional breakdown, and he says this in Numbers 11. Why have you brought this evil on your servant? Why have I failed to find favor in your eyes that you placed the burden of this people on me? Did I conceive them? Did I give birth to this people that you should say to me, carry it in your lap as a nurse carries a baby? Where am I going to find meat to give to this people when they cry, saying, give us meat? I can't carry this people on my own. It's too heavy. If this is what you're doing to me, then, if I have found this favor in your eyes, kill me now. Hargeni na harog. Kill me now and let me not look upon this, my evil. This is a benchmark of despair. Many leaders who are close to the Torah will read this passage at low points and think, with the wisdom of Rabbi Sacks, okay, if I haven't yet reached that point, I'm okay. Rabbi Sacks wrote that somehow the knowledge that the greatest Jewish leader of all time experienced that depth of darkness is actually empowering. It says that the feeling of failure doesn't necessarily mean that a person has failed. It means that they haven't yet succeeded. Still less, and this is very important, still less does it mean that the person is a failure. To the contrary, failure comes to those who take risks, and the willingness to take risks is absolutely necessary if you seek to change the world for the better. These dark nights of the soul come to some of the greatest heroes of the Spirit. Moses is not the only prophet to pray to die. Elijah does, Jeremiah does, and Jonah does. Arguably, Job does as well, but we're not 1,000% sure he was even Jewish, and that book is about something else. But nonetheless, these great men, tapped for greatness, whose voices we still hear, prayed to die. The Psalms are shot through with moments of despair. And what the Tanakh is telling us in these stories is profoundly liberating. Judaism is not a recipe for blandness or bliss. This life is not a guarantee that we'll be spared heartache and pain. We have Shabbat to be an antidote to heartache and pain. It's not what the Stoics sought, called apatheia, a life undisturbed by passion, nor is it a path to nirvana, stilling the fires of feeling by extinguishing the self. These things have a spiritual beauty, and we can find them in some of the mystical strands of Judaism, but they're not in the world of the heroes and heroines of the Tanakh. Why? Because Judaism is a faith for those who seek to change the world, and that is unusual. Many religions are about accepting the world the way it is. Judaism is a protest against the world that is, in the name of the world that ought to be. When the ark goes forward, may the enemies scatter, and when it rests, may all of those scattered come home. To be a Jew is to try to make a difference, to try to change lives for the better, to heal some of the scars of our fractured world, but people don't like change. That's why Moses, David, Elijah, and Jeremiah, among others, found life so hard. The people had complained about food earlier. In Exodus 16, they were hungry and they needed food, and that was a legitimate request. But since then, they've been to Sinai. They weren't starving. They have the Torah and they have the manna. Their complaint was that it was boring. What made Moses feel his entire mission had failed and would continue to fail was that he was trying to help the Israelites make a society that would be the opposite of Egypt, that would liberate instead of oppress, dignify and not enslave. But the people hadn't changed. Worse, they had taken refuge in the most absurd and damaging nostalgia for the Egypt they had left. Moses felt if the people had not changed by now, it was a reasonable assumption that they never would. Moses was staring at his own defeat. There was no point in carrying on. But God comforts him. Primarily, he tells him to gather 70 elders to share with him the burden of leadership. And the quail that comes and the meat that plagues the people, that's for another time. But as the Parsha goes on, Moses calms. He has people to help him. When there is a group of people that seem to be mounting a challenge to his leadership, he says to Joshua, don't worry. Would that all the people had the Spirit of the Lord upon them. When God punishes Miriam at the end of the Parsha, Moses prays, And it is specifically at this point when he prays for her well-being and recovery. Finally, at this point in the long account of Moses' life, the Torah says, this man Moses was very humble, more so than any other man on earth. This is a remarkable account of the psychodynamics of emotional crisis. It's important in the midst of despair, we are told not to be alone. God comforts Moses and lifts him up. He speaks directly to Moses' concern. He assures him he doesn't have to be alone in the future. There will be others to help him. And he tells him, don't worry about the people's complaint. If it's meat they want, they'll have it, and they won't complain about the food again. Rabbi Sachs teaches that the essential principle here is what the sages meant in the Talmud, in Brachot, when they say, a prisoner cannot release himself from prison. There needs to be someone else to lift you up from sadness. That's why Judaism is so insistent on not leaving people alone when they are vulnerable. We visit the sick and comfort mourners and include the stranger, the orphan, and the widow. An act is hospitality that is said to be greater than receiving the presence of God. We are also told that surviving despair is a character-transforming experience. It is when your self-esteem is ground to dust that you can finally realize that life isn't about you. It's about others and ideals and a sense of mission or vocation. What matters is the cause, not the person. That's what humility is about. As the saying goes, popularly attributed to C.S. Lewis, humility is not about thinking less of yourself. It is about thinking of yourself less. Even if you've gone through the most bruising experiences, you are stronger than you ever believed possible. When you get to the bottom, as Moses does in this Parsha, you finally learn not to put your self-image on the line. This is what Rabbi Yochanan meant when he said, greatness is humility. Greatness, and it's the greatness of Judaism, is that it's a faith that is turned outward so that other people's suffering is supposed to matter to you more than your own. The mark of greatness is the combination of strength and gentleness that is among the most healing forces in human life. Moses thought he was a failure, and it's worth remembering that every time we think we are failures. His journey from utter despair to self-effacing strength and humility is one of the great narratives in the Torah. It is, as Rabbi Sachs taught so beautifully, a timeless tutorial in hope. Shabbat Shalom.